Lydia, thank you very much for reading. Sorry about insisting on those names at the end. You read them very, very well. Welcome if you're a visitor. It's very good to have you here with us. If you're a visitor, you won't have been here last week when we began our series in 2 Samuel. So just look back to 2 verse 7, which is where we ended last week. 2 verse 7, it's an appeal to a city called Jabesh-Gilead from the new king of Judah. It says, "Be strong and be valiant, for Saul your Lord is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." It's a pitch. It's saying, please follow me now. That's what David's saying, which is all very well. But Jabesh-Gilead was saved by Saul. So you'd think really you'd expect them to follow one of his sons, not his enemy David. And actually, even if they wanted to, Jabesh-Gilead is 100 miles away from where David is king. And in between is the army of Saul, led by his strongest general Abner, and also the army of the Philistines. So be strong and be valiant. I am king now. Except you're not, are you? The people of Jabesh-Gilead might have said. And we need saving now. And you are 100 miles away. Now that, I think, is a window into the purpose of this whole section of 2 Samuel. This book, the author of the book, wants the reader to give their loyalty to the house of David. Give your loyalty to the house of David through good and bad, success or disaster. Stick with David and his successors. 2 Samuel was written, if you like, for a national referendum. It could have been useful when it came to vote Remain. Vote Remain in the union of Israel and Judah, a bit later on. And God had this book written knowing that that purpose is going to be important for all of the rest of time. That purpose. Give your loyalty to the house of David, to the son of David. Give your loyalty to Jesus. And people sometimes say that the Old Testament is difficult to apply to modern life, but that is normally because they're trying to take every tiny detail and make it mean something about the washing up or something like that in your daily life. Give your loyalty to Jesus, even when he looks weak. That is what this evening's chapters are about. The challenge of 2 verse 7 to us, it comes to us who live in London, live in 2016. Be strong and be valiant. I am king now, says Jesus. And my heart often replies, well, except you're not, are you? London feels like thousands of miles from where Jesus is king. And in between are any number of strong leaders or even gods and any number of enemies. And God the Father asks us to give our loyalty to his Son. And he asks us to do it now, before his kingdom comes. Will you give your loyalty? And last week we looked at the character of David, and we said that is a way into the character of Jesus. God's king is humble and patient and loyal and loving. That is actually the only kind of king who could rule under God without being a rival to him. But that lovely character, maybe it increases our problem. Because it's easy to think that a humble and patient king is a weak king. Is Jesus just a bit pathetic? And our chapters today, they say that would be a very dangerous mistake to make with Jesus. So Jesus is humble. He chose crucifixion. And he chooses patience now, while he waits for people to repent. And he chooses words, chooses a gospel instead of guns as his method of expansion. And it's easy to think that is just weakness and it won't work. I don't know if you read the papers this week. They were very excited that the first survey has shown there are now more people of no religion in England than there are Christians, even nominal Christians. It's now 48.5% compared to 43.8%. Does that mean that Jesus is finished? Well, it might mean that the institutional Church of England might be finished. But Jesus is God's king. And with the story of David's rise open, it would be a dangerous mistake to think a humble and patient king is a weak king. We're going to flip around a little bit through these chapters. Just get 5 verse 10 back open again, page 310. This is our basic story tonight. 5 verse 10, David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, the God of armies, was with him. That's the story tonight. That is the big point. God's King Jesus will become greater and greater, for God is with him. And to feel that point properly, we need to see how unlikely that was in David's case. So just look down to 5 verse 6 to see how it felt at the time. That's our first point. Point 1, David cannot come in here. 5 verse 6. That is the Jebusites speaking. They are the people who are in charge of Jerusalem. They held on to Jerusalem against Joshua a few hundred years before. And they do not think that this little upstart David will be any different. Jerusalem is a mountain fortress, and they look at David and his army, and they look at their walls, and they say, 5 verse 6, all we need is to fill the walls with a bunch of archers who cannot see, and a bunch of soldiers who cannot walk, and you still couldn't get in here. You're not coming in. But the walls of Jerusalem are just the latest reason why David should not ever be king of Israel in Jerusalem. I put a list on the sheet of what just a few people have to say about David during the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel so far. So we'll go pretty quickly. His own dad thought he was so small and insignificant, it wasn't even worth bringing him in to meet Samuel the prophet. And Samuel, he agreed, and God had to tell Samuel not to look at how tall all the brothers were. Then Goliath, just a chapter later, he nearly died of laughter. He had the entire Israelite army terrified of him, shaking in their tents every time he spoke, and out comes David, the shepherd boy. Am I a dog that you come after me with sticks? And then David, so he's anointed secretly, and he does knock over a giant, but still the idea of him being king is laughable. When Saul offers him a royal wedding, David says, who am I? And who are my relatives that I should be son-in-law to the king? And that is actually the high point of his career. That is the best he ever gets. And his career goes severely downhill from there until he is fleeing for his life and an entire nation state is trying to kill him. And as a refugee with no choices, he comes to his enemies, the Philistines, and they only decide not to kill him because he does such a great impression of a terrified, mad person. And by 24 verse 14 of 1 Samuel, that is David speaking. He's asking Saul, why have you brought out the entire army to hunt David, who is just a flea, just a dead dog? This little boy, this hopeless refugee, this upstart rebel with a few scruffy followers, says, be strong and be valiant. I am your king now. You think you're not, and you won't be. And it's not sensible to give your loyalty to somebody so weak. And our chapters today, from chapter 2 to chapter 5, they cover 7 years and 6 months of agonizing choice for the people of Israel. David is king of Judah, 2 verse 4, but not king of Israel. And in chapter 2 verse 9, we have a much more sensible choice of king. We have the son of the last one. That is how it normally works, isn't it? Let's go with him. And the odds are 11 to 1. 2 verse 9 describes where David doesn't rule, and it is everywhere except Judah. The odds are 11 to 1, 11 tribes to 1. And apart from Saul's son, we have the man who runs the army, Abner, who is getting stronger and stronger. And think about it, even if somehow David survives an 11 to 1 civil war, you would expect most of those armies to be dead by the end, wouldn't you? That is what chapter 2 reminds us of. Civil wars normally do bitterness and division and blood feud and weakness. There's just no chance of David turning this round and then beating the Philistines. When Saul couldn't even manage that, when everybody was united and everyone was still alive. David, you cannot be king. You cannot come in here. It's laughable. He's too weak. Now that picture of David, that picture of David's career, that is massive in the Bible. Half of the Psalms are by David, and there are 13 of them where he tells us when he wrote them. And 8, maybe 9 of those 13 are from when David was running away from Saul. Only 2 of them are about something good happening to David. And when Jesus wants to explain what is happening to him, it is this part of David's life that he goes to. The miserable bits, the refugee bit, the weak bits. Students coming to the end of John's Gospel, you'll have seen Psalm 69 3 times in John's Gospel. That is why they hate me, says Jesus. It is because I'm like David, who was always hated. And actually, that's why they'll hate you, Jesus says. That's why they'll hate you after I'm gone. Just like David sang. More people hate me. This is a gloomy song, isn't it? Unless you're very bald. David sang, more people hate me for no reason than I have hairs on my head. It's a lot of people. And they're mighty, and they want to destroy me. And that is the first 37 years of David's life. Anybody here younger than 37? All that period of David's life being hated. Why would you give your loyalty to him? And we live now in a period of history when Jesus said we would be hated the way that people hated David in Psalm 69. It's not going to be obvious at all to most people why you should give your loyalty to Jesus. If we expect our Christian life to be like palace building time from 5 verse 1, if you expect non-believers like King Hiram of Tyre to email you and say, you are great, you're so great, you followers of God, please can I build you a palace? If you expect it to be like that, when Jesus tells us that following David, following him is going to be like David the homeless fugitive, then we'll give up very easily, won't we? So why would you give your loyalty to somebody so unlikely to be king? But then point two is where the story goes. David grew stronger and stronger. 3 verse 1. That is the story of our chapters. 3 verse 1 is a summary. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. Remember, 11 to 1 in Saul's favor. So what happens? David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. It's what Jamie read to us earlier on. It is God exalting his king. Hannah's prayer at the beginning of 1 Samuel told us that the humble will be lifted up and become stronger and stronger, and the proud will be pushed down and become weaker and weaker. That is why this humble king is not going to stay weak. And you can track that different ways through our story. You can track it through David's titles. He is king of Judah in chapter 2. He is king of Israel in 5 verse 3. And he is king of all Israel and Judah in Jerusalem by 5 verse 5. You can also track it in the section breaks. that the author puts in. The chapter and verse numbers aren't in the original, and we have the list of horrible names that Lydia read for us to break it up. You get 4 verses each time listing names. And in our chapters, the names are all the names of babies and of wives. So 2 verse 2, David brings his recently rescued refugee wives to Hebron. Then 3 verse 2 is the first section break. And there are 6 wives, and each wife has a baby son. And notice this is not just a sort of sweet moment. You don't kind of go, oh, sweet, if the family business is being king. This is more like the annual report to investors. This is the kind of primary utility of monarchy over the form of government that Israel had before. The point is, when the old leader dies, it can be a real mess. You get civil war, just like chapter 2. And we're having civil war because the house of Saul has run out of babies, basically. Saul got killed, and the 3 sons who were any good, they all got killed at the battle with him, which leaves Ishbosheth, who is 40 and doesn't seem to have any sons. And there is one grandson, 4 verse 4, who is 5 years old and who had an accident on the day that his grandfather Saul died, and he hasn't been able to walk properly since. And the lame may think they can hold a mountaintop fortress with big walls, but they cannot rule Bronze Age kingdoms. And by 5 verse 13, the names we had read, well, the last son of Saul is dead, and David is in Jerusalem, and the stats on baby production are through the roof. We thought that 6 was a good result, but we have nearly doubled it. There's 11 more sons. That's an 83% improvement. And actually, we have industrialized the number of wives. And there are too many daughters to even list. You can see David getting stronger and stronger. You can also track David getting stronger as he overcomes every challenge. So we have an 11-1 battle in chapter 2. And at the end of it, David's army has lost 19 soldiers, and Saul's army has lost 360 soldiers, 2 verse 30. Then do you remember that there was a kind of continuity problem? You have the son of the last king and the general who commanded Saul's army. That is quite a powerful combination. But by 3 verse 7, those two start fighting. They start fighting among themselves. And the general has a bright idea. He decides that maybe David can be his puppet king now instead of Ishbosheth. And he does the deal, and that, maybe we're a bit worried about that. David's going to have someone else in charge of him. But the general ends up dead at the end of chapter 3. And you think, nice bit of political maneuvering, David, well done. But actually, even there, David comes out smelling of roses. 3 verse 36. The people are pleased, and they all understand that David had nothing to do with the removal of the one man strong enough to control him. It's amazing, isn't it? In London, we are 6 weeks from the publication of the Chilcot report. How likely do you think it is that any leader could emerge from the brutality of war and murder with their reputation for gentleness and trustworthiness enhanced? How likely is that in the real world? But that is what happened to David in chapter 3. So the second section ends just like the first. That's 5 verse 10 that we've already quoted. David became greater and greater. However unlikely it seemed, point 1, David just keeps getting stronger. And this story of the little shepherd boy who ended up emperor of the Middle East, that is the background to Jesus' promises about himself. And on the sheet you've got Mark 12 and 1 Corinthians 15 that both go to Psalm 110, which is a psalm of David, but it is not one of the gloomy ones. David sings about a conversation, about hearing God speak to a king, a son of David, who is so much greater than David that David calls him Lord. And the verse goes, the Lord, that one, says to my Lord, the king, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And Jesus says, that is me, that person who David sang about, greater than him. And Acts 17 says God made that clear by raising Jesus from the dead. David rose from being a shepherd boy to being an emperor. Jesus managed that with death. God has raised him up. And 1 Corinthians 15 says Jesus is on a throne and he is waiting. Just like David on a throne in Hebron in chapter 2. Clearly the king, clearly the anointed king, clearly the one that God has made his promises to, but waiting. Waiting for his enemies to stop being his enemies and become his footstool instead. And 1 Corinthians says the final enemy on the list is not going to be Saul, and it isn't a Philistine. It says the final enemy is death. I went to a funeral this week, and I guess there'll be other people in the room maybe who did. Isn't that a great kind of king? The king who one day will ask death to bow down so he can put his feet on him and reverse death. Why should you give your loyalty now to somebody who seems unlikely to be a king? Because it is obviously worth being on the side of the one who's going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. It's obviously worth of being on the side of somebody who one day is going to put their feet on death. Even if it costs you your life, clearly you've made the right choice. Let's imagine that through one person. His name was Abiathar, real person from the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. Abiathar was there the day that Saul murdered his father and 85 of his brothers and cousins. He did it because his dad gave some food to David, just because his dad hadn't yet had the memo about David no longer being, trusted friend and actually being public enemy number one. So Saul killed a lot of them, except Abiathar, who escaped. And you'd think he would have every reason to give up and hide, wouldn't he? Every reason to hide. No more David, no more Saul, I've had it. But he runs to David. And the whole time David is on the run, Abiathar is with him, advising him and leading the worship of God with David. Abiathar stuck with David through any number of crises and disasters. There'd be any number of reasons to take back the loyalty and go and do something else more sensible. But Abiathar stuck with him. How does Abiathar feel as David becomes greater and greater and greater? Abiathar was a priest, and as far as we don't know quite who did it, but it may well have been Abiathar who stood next to David and anointed him king of Judah. That's a good start, isn't it? Good reward for your loyalty. And then 7 years later, anointed him king of Israel. This has been worth it, don't you think he would have thought? Why give your loyalty to Jesus now? Because God's king will become stronger and stronger. And on that day, being one of his loyal followers from the days in the desert, from the refugee days, that will be the position that everybody wishes they were in. So we need to be absolutely sure. So let's come to point 3. Why is it that David got stronger and stronger? Why can we think that Jesus will? Point 3, because the Lord had established him for the sake of his people. And that is 5 verse 12. Or look down at chapter 5 again. Turn back to chapter 5. Because you might think that David was just really very clever or really very lucky. So you might look at the capture of Jerusalem, 5 verse 8. David wants some volunteers for an SAS mission. The Jebusites said you can't come in here, but David did, because he wants some volunteers to climb up the water shaft, and then we'll give those allegedly blind and lame defenders the surprise of their lives. You might think it's because he's clever, but the author of this book and King David himself wouldn't want you to think that. 5 verse 10, he became greater and greater. Why? for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. And 5 verse 12, David is still clear what's been going on. David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. There's no doubt there at all, is there? The Lord did this, not David. And God was strong enough to do it because he is the Lord of hosts. He commands all the armies in the heavens, and actually elsewhere in the Bible we know he can push around the armies on the earth as well. God did this, and he did it for the sake of his people. And again, you could read back over the story and track right through it and see again and again the sign that God is doing it. Don't turn to all of these, but 2 verse 1, that is David's normal battle tactics. Every time you got a decision, you ask God what we should do. Shall I go up to Judah? Yes. Okay. Which city? Answer, Hebron. So he goes. It's the same strategy in 5 verse 19 and 5 verse 23. Long before radar or satellite surveillance, David has something even better. God will tell him exactly how to win every battle. In chapter 3, we learn that Saul's general Abner knows what is going on. 3 verse 9, God has sworn to take the kingdom from Saul and give it to David. And so Abner, maybe just 7 years late, after trying to go against this, he suddenly has a bright idea. Why don't I accomplish for you what God has sworn to do? And I think the point in the comedy is that even if someone like Abner helps out, really it is God who is doing this. David knows it's been like that for 30 years for him. 4 verse 9, the Lord has redeemed my life out of every adversity. And the point there is, David really doesn't need a couple of gangsters like Baanah and Rechab to murder the previous king for. God will see it done. And then only 7 years and 6 months late, the elders of all Israel come and make a covenant with David in 5 verse 3. They give their loyalty to God's king. And all the signs along the way are that David's character is unchanged. He trusts God, and that is why God did this for him. He doesn't kind of aggressively push hard. He humbly waits and he obeys. He's not a brutal strong man. He is, 3 verse 39, gentle, even though he's anointed king. He's not severe or an evildoer or wicked. It is God who did this. And the story of David, it will get a bit more complicated before we finish the book. David is not perfect and sinless in the end. And there are just sort of little stories here just to make us worry, or little stories that when we hear them again and again and again through the book, we will come back to. But this week, the author wants us to give David the benefit of the doubt. So the wives, I think, just one example from the wives. We said earlier that David industrializes the production of babies, and we might think, I'm not sure if that is a good idea, David. And even in chapter 3, there is a weeping husband who gets told to shove off and go home by a general because David wants his wife now. And that is a story that is going to repeat later in the book in a really, really bad way. But for now, I think the author wants us to give David the benefit of the doubt. The wife that we're talking about there, he was David's wife before she was given away to somebody else who stole her from him. So really all we're doing is reuniting a happy couple. That's okay, isn't it? Little stories that we'll come back to. David is not perfect, not sinless in the end. But in chapters 2 to 5, the author wants us to get a very simple story. This is the story of God's king as he should be, as he will be in Jesus. God's king as God will make it when God makes a promise. When God says, I'm going to give you the kingdom, this is how it goes. When God says, I will be with you, wait patiently, this is how it ends up. So the only question for us is whether you think God has sworn to make Jesus king. Do you think God has promised to make Jesus king? Do you think God was with Jesus? That would be another question. Do you think Jesus was a patient and humble king? And they're really easy questions, aren't they? Those questions. The central event in world history was God choosing a king to rule forever. That's what the whole Bible is about, leading up through the past in prophecies that come true and pointing back afterwards. God chose a king to rule forever. He did it for the sake of his people. That is the big plan, to rescue human beings. God to choose his people. It is God's choice. There is no referendum on this one, no vote. And God has chosen his only son, Jesus. He's chosen him, he's proved it by raising him from the dead. And I want us to turn to Psalm 2 just to finish. The page number is 537, which is on the sheet. Turn to Psalm 2. Page 537, Psalm 2. It is the other huge royal psalm, a bit like Psalm 110, the other psalm that gets quoted lots and lots and lots in the New Testament. And you look at Psalm 2, and verses 1 to 3 are the world we live in. It is a world where the majority of people, the nations and their leaders, wish they could be free of God and plot ways to break free of him. 48.5% of England this year have no religion. 99.9% of the people commenting on The Guardian underneath the article about that. But it could be 99% of the world one day. And it would still be only what is here in this psalm. The all-out revolt to get rid of God's king. And God's response to it is quite famous. It's there in verse 4. God sees the whole world thinking they might be able to stop his son being king, and God just laughs at them. He thinks it's funny that anybody thinks they could prevent Jesus being king. Verse 6, I have set my king where I want him, in Jerusalem, in Zion. And verse 7, the king can say, God has promised, you are my son. The author of 2 Samuel is very, very clear. It would be very dangerous to think that a humble and patient King Jesus must be a weak King Jesus. You should give, we must give our loyalty to Jesus. Psalm 2 ends saying, kiss the Son, rebels against him. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry when he is king. Because blessed are all who take refuge in him. Let me lead us in prayer. Dear Father God, thank you for your decision and your promise that you will have Jesus as king over the universe. Thank you that you have set your king on a throne and that you will place all his enemies under his feet. Father, you know how hard it is when opposition and other things press in on us, how hard it is to go on giving our loyalty to him. Father, please help us. Encourage us by this story of David, by what you did 3,000 years ago in raising a small boy to be king, because you promised that we would trust you will do it again with the Lord Jesus Christ, and that we will be so glad that we stuck with him and followed him. We ask in his name. Amen.